Remember those forgotten casserole recipes you could only find in old cookbooks? They filled tables fast, made the most of leftovers, and kept families close. How did meals that comforting just fade away? Tuna noodle casserole with crushed potato chips was one of those dinners nearly every family had in rotation between the 1950s and 1980s. It was not glamorous, but it got the job done. You boiled macaroni, stirred in canned tuna and cream of mushroom soup, maybe tossed in peas if you were feeling fancy, and then came the best part, the potato chip topping. A salty layer of crushed chips baked right on top turned this pantry meal into something comforting that stretched as far as it needed to. It was cheap, filling, and ready in 20 minutes. You found this recipe in every old community cookbook and scribbled on faded index cards. It made the rounds at school concerts, potlucks, and weeknight tables when money was tight. Over time, frozen dinners replaced it, but for anyone who remembers that creamy, crispy bite, tuna noodle casserole was pure comfort, a simple, resourceful meal that kept families fed. Beef and biscuit bake was the shortcut dinner that showed up on tables across America from the 1960s to the 1980s, especially when nobody had the energy for fancy cooking. You browned ground beef, simmered it with gravy or condensed soup, poured it into a baking dish, and topped it with canned biscuits that puffed up golden and flaky. It was cozy, filling, and stretched meat farther to make sure nobody went to bed hungry. You found this recipe in old fundraiser cookbooks or scribbled on recipe cards with grease stains. It was born out of practicality. Use whatever meat you had, pop open biscuits, and dinner was done. But like a lot of old-school casseroles, beef and biscuit bake slowly disappeared as complicated meals or trendy diets took over. Still, for the folks who remember scooping out fluffy biscuit and savory beef, it brings back the feeling of home when life outside felt uncertain. Ham and potato scallop casserole was what you made the week after Easter, Thanksgiving, or any holiday that left you with leftover ham. You sliced potatoes thin as paper, layered them with salty ham, poured on creamy sauce, and baked until browned on top. It was the definition of a leftover makeover, simple, comforting, and guaranteed to stretch ham into a full meal. Old cookbooks were full of scalloped potato recipes, but adding ham made it a staple. Some folks dressed it up with onions or cheese, but most kept it simple. Over the years, scalloped potato casseroles quietly faded out as convenience foods took over and leftovers went to the freezer. But back when wasting food was never an option, this casserole kept families fed and brought warmth to the table long after the party ended. Chicken divan with broccoli and cheese sauce was the casserole you made when company came over, but the grocery budget still had the final say. This dish showed up in kitchens from the 1950s to the 1980s. You took leftover chicken, layered it with broccoli, poured on creamy cheddar sauce, and baked it to perfection. Some versions added breadcrumbs or a splash of sherry if you were feeling fancy, but most kept it simple. You found chicken divan recipes in magazines or old church cookbooks, promising a fancy dinner with everyday ingredients. It was a proud, practical way to stretch leftovers and sneak in vegetables. Over time, casseroles like this disappeared as prepackaged meals and microwaves took over dinner duty. But for folks who remember scooping out cheesy chicken and broccoli, it brings back memories of neighbors gathered around the table and meals that still felt special. Cheesy rice and sausage bake was one of those hearty, filling casseroles that carried families through the tough times of the 1970s, especially when every dollar counted. You would cook up some rice, brown slices of spicy sausage, mix it all with shredded cheese, and bake until it came out bubbling and golden. It was simple, practical, and came straight from those old, spiral-bound cookbooks or recipe cards passed between neighbors. The beauty of this casserole was how flexible it was. Swap the sausage for whatever meat you had, toss in extra vegetables if they were lying around, and dinner was done. It fed a crowd, filled the kitchen with that unmistakable cheesy aroma, and made sure nobody left the table hungry. Over the years, casseroles like this quietly disappeared as trends moved toward prepackaged meals or quick microwave dinners. But for anyone who remembers spooning out cheesy, steamy helpings of rice and sausage on cold weeknights, it was a reminder that sometimes The best meals came from simple ingredients and a little resourcefulness. Macaroni and tomato casserole was the Depression-era dinner that made a little pasta and canned tomatoes stretch farther than you would ever expect. You would boil up elbow macaroni, open a can of stewed tomatoes. Maybe crush them with your hands and mix it all together with a little salt, pepper, and butter if you could spare it. Some folks topped it with breadcrumbs or grated cheese when they were lucky, but most kept it plain and practical. This casserole was a staple in factory towns, farm kitchens, and anywhere folks were scraping by during hard times. You would find it scribbled in old cookbooks, passed by word of mouth, or jotted on recipe cards tucked in kitchen drawers. It was simple, filling, and did the job when grocery lists ran short and paychecks ran even shorter. Over time, macaroni and tomato casseroles like this faded out as newer, flashier meals took their place. Bologna and noodle bake might sound a little strange today, but back in leaner times, it was a beloved dinner that kept families fed without breaking the bank. You would slice up bologna, yes, the lunch meat, layer it with cooked noodles, canned soup, and sometimes a handful of shredded cheese if you had it, and bake it all together. It was the ultimate pantry meal when money was tight and creativity was the only thing filling the fridge. You would spot recipes like this in old community cookbooks or handwritten on recipe cards stained from years of use. The casserole made use of leftovers, stretched meat farther, and turned everyday odds and ends into something warm, filling, and familiar. Sure, it was not fancy, but for a lot of families, it was exactly what dinner needed to be: cheap, easy, and satisfying. Over the years, bologna and noodle casseroles quietly vanished from most tables, replaced by frozen meals and takeout menus. Cornbread tamale pie was the casserole that turned Tex-Mex flavors into pure comfort food, especially in kitchens where every meal had to stretch. You would brown some ground beef, stir in tomatoes and spices, pour it into a baking dish, and top it with a thick layer of sweet cornbread batter. When it baked up golden and fluffy, the whole house would smell like pure magic. Recipes like this showed up in faded cookbooks, handwritten cards, and neighborhood potlucks from the 1940s to the 1980s. It was simple, filling, and gave plain ground beef a whole new life. Some folks added cheese or olives when they were feeling fancy, but most kept it basic and budget-friendly. Over time, tamale pie slipped off most dinner tables as ready-made meals took over and people forgot how satisfying a one-dish dinner could be. But for the families who remember scooping out steaming helpings of spicy beef and sweet cornbread, it brings back the feeling of gathering together and making the best out of what was on hand. Chicken and stuffing casserole was the no-fuss dinner that showed up in kitchens all across America when leftovers needed a second act. You would take cooked chicken, layer it with boxed stuffing mix, pour on some broth or cream soup, and bake until bubbly and golden. It was the perfect recipe for stretching leftovers after Sunday dinner, holidays, or whenever the fridge looked sparse. Old cookbooks were packed with versions of this casserole, promising an easy, hearty meal with ingredients you probably already had. It brought together savory stuffing, tender chicken, and creamy sauce into one warm, filling bake that fed the whole family. Some versions called for vegetables like peas or carrots tossed in, but most folks kept it plain and practical. Over the years, casseroles like this faded away as frozen meals and fast food took over weeknight dinners. But for anyone who remembers the smell of stuffing crisping in the oven and the simple comfort of a one-dish meal, pork chop rice bake was the hearty one-dish dinner that turned plain pork and pantry staples into something filling enough to satisfy the whole family. You would brown bone-in pork chops, layer them over seasoned rice, pour on broth, and bake until everything was tender and steamy. It was the kind of casserole that showed up when money was tight, but nobody wanted to skip dinner. You would find recipes for this tucked in old cookbooks, scrawled on recipe cards, or clipped from magazines promising easy meals for busy families. The pork chops flavored the rice as it cooked, making sure nothing went to waste. Some versions called for mushrooms, onions, or extra seasonings if you had them lying around, but most kept it simple and satisfying. Over the years, pork chop rice casseroles like this slipped off modern menus as people reached for quicker, trendier meals. But for those who remember pulling a bubbling dish out of the oven and scooping out savory rice under tender pork, it brings back the feeling of home-cooked meals that worked hard and fed everyone. Egg and cheese breakfast casserole was the secret weapon of every potluck, church brunch, and family gathering from the 1960s through the 1980s. You would cube up day-old bread, whisk together eggs and milk, toss in shredded cheese and sometimes bacon or sausage if you had it, then let the whole thing bake into a golden, fluffy casserole. It was simple, filling, and designed to feed a crowd without much effort. People loved how you could prep it the night before, pop it in the oven the next morning, and have breakfast handled while the coffee brewed. You would find this recipe scribbled in faded cookbooks or passed between neighbors on index cards, often stained from years of use. It showed up everywhere: holiday mornings, baby showers, and Sunday potlucks, back when casseroles were still the pride of the kitchen. Over time, grab-and-go breakfasts and fast food drive-thrus replaced cozy bakes like this. But for anyone who remembers the smell of cheese bubbling in the oven and plates piled high with warm, eggy casserole, it brings back the comfort of slowing down and sharing a meal. Zucchini and cheese bake was the sneaky vegetable casserole that showed up everywhere during the 1970s garden boom, back when folks were growing zucchinis the size of baseball bats and scrambling for recipes to use them up. You would shred fresh zucchini, mix it with eggs, shredded cheese, and breadcrumbs, and bake until it turned into a golden, bubbly dish that somehow got even the pickiest eaters to eat their veggies. This casserole was a lifesaver during peak garden season when you could not give zucchini away fast enough. It popped up in community cookbooks, gardening magazines, and handwritten recipe cards swapped over backyard fences. Some folks added herbs or even ground beef to make it heartier, but most kept it simple and cheesy. Over the years, as backyard gardens shrank and prepackaged veggies took over, zucchini bakes like this quietly slipped off most dinner tables. But for the families who remember pulling this cheesy, veggie-packed casserole out of the oven, it brings back memories of homemade meals. Spam and potato casserole was one of those scrappy dinners that kept families fed during World War II, especially when meat was rationed and creativity was a survival skill. You would slice canned spam over thinly sliced potatoes, pour on some creamy sauce made from condensed soup or milk, and bake the whole thing until bubbly and browned. It was practical, cheap, and filled bellies when fresh meat was hard to come by. Spam was everywhere back then, shipped to soldiers overseas and stacked on grocery shelves back home, and casseroles like this turned that humble can into a meal. You would spot this recipe in wartime pamphlets, government cookbooks, and scribbled notes tucked inside kitchen drawers. Over the years, spam and potato bakes faded away as fresh meats became more available and convenience foods changed dinner routines. But for those who remember scraping the last crispy edges out of the casserole dish, it was more than just dinner. It was a reminder of how far a little ingenuity could stretch when times were tough. Cabbage roll casserole was the answer for anyone who loved stuffed cabbage but did not have the time or patience to roll them by hand. You would layer chopped cabbage with seasoned ground beef, rice, tomatoes, and sauce, then bake the whole thing into a hearty, comforting meal that tasted just like the real thing. This casserole showed up in kitchens from the 1950s through the 1980s, passed down in old community cookbooks and scribbled on recipe cards tucked into kitchen drawers. It was practical, filling, and made good use of pantry staples when fresh ingredients were scarce. Cabbage was cheap, ground beef stretched far, and rice made sure nobody left the table hungry. Some folks spiced it up with herbs or cheese, but most kept it simple and satisfying. Over time, as convenience foods took over and fewer folks wanted to fuss with cabbage, this bake slipped off most dinner tables. But for those who remember the smell of bubbling tomatoes and tender cabbage filling the kitchen, it brings back a cozy kind of pride in making the best of what you had. Turkey tetrazzini casserole was the go-to dinner after Thanksgiving or Christmas, when the fridge was packed with leftover turkey and nobody wanted plain sandwiches for the third day in a row. You would toss shredded turkey with cooked pasta, creamy mushroom sauce, and sometimes peas, then top it all with cheese or breadcrumbs and bake until bubbly. It was hearty, creamy, and made those holiday leftovers feel like a whole new meal. Recipes for this casserole popped up in community cookbooks, homemaking magazines, and recipe boxes all over America from the 1950s through the 1980s. It was practical, filling, and gave holiday meals a satisfying encore. Some versions added sherry or extra herbs for flair, but most folks kept it simple. Over the years, as fast food, microwaves, and meal kits took over, turkey tetrazzini slowly faded away from dinner tables. But for anyone who remembers scooping out creamy, cheesy forkfuls after a big holiday meal, it brings back the feeling of stretching leftovers with love and getting one last cozy meal out of the celebration. Baked rice pudding casserole was the humble, sweet dessert that showed up in American kitchens when there was not much to spare, but everyone still wanted something comforting to end the meal. You would mix cooked rice with milk, sugar, eggs, and maybe some raisins or nutmeg, pour it all into a casserole dish, and bake until golden and set. It was simple, filling, and made the most of leftovers, especially in homes where wasting food was never an option. You would spot this recipe in old church cookbooks, community fundraiser pamphlets, and scribbled notes tucked inside kitchen drawers. It was a dessert that made rice, a pantry staple, feel a little special, especially after a long day of hard work or tough times. Some folks added cinnamon or a dollop of jam, but most kept it plain and practical. Over the years, as flashy desserts and store-bought sweets took over, rice pudding casseroles like this quietly slipped off the menu. But for those who remember scooping out warm, creamy spoonfuls, it brings back the simple joy of making do with what you had and still finding something sweet. Ground beef and corn casserole was pure comfort food from rural kitchens where meals had to stretch and nobody could afford to let anything go to waste. You would brown up ground beef, mix in creamed corn, and bake the whole thing under a fluffy layer of cornbread topping until it came out golden and bubbling. It was hearty, filling, and used ingredients that most families already had in the pantry. Recipes like this showed up in old cookbooks from the 1940s through the 1970s, scribbled on index cards, and shared at church suppers or neighborhood potlucks. It was the kind of one-dish meal that filled bellies without much fuss and made plain ground beef feel special. Some folks added cheese or green chilies for extra flavor, but most kept it basic and practical. Over time, casseroles like this slipped off most dinner tables as frozen meals, and fast food replaced home cooking. But for anyone who remembers digging into that steamy, cornbread-topped bake, it brings back the cozy pride of stretching ingredients and feeding a family with a little creativity. Green bean and hot dog bake might sound strange today, but back when groceries were tight, it was a thrifty way to turn humble ingredients into a hot, filling meal. You would slice up hot dogs, toss them with green beans and a creamy sauce, usually condensed soup, and bake the whole thing until bubbly. It was simple, salty, and surprisingly satisfying, especially when budgets were stretched thin and families needed something quick. You would spot this recipe in those old spiral-bound cookbooks, government pamphlets, or handwritten cards passed down in the kitchen drawer. It made the most of cheap staples, canned green beans, hot dogs, and soup, and turned them into dinner when there was not much else in the fridge. Some folks tossed breadcrumbs or shredded cheese on top, but most kept it practical and plain. Over the years, casseroles like this quietly disappeared as ready-made meals and restaurant dinners became the norm. But for anyone who grew up scraping the last spoonful from the dish, it is a reminder that even the oddest combinations can fill a table and bring a little comfort. Chicken and rice casserole with mushroom soup was the shortcut dinner that got American families through busy weeknights for decades, especially when time and money were both in short supply. You would mix cooked rice with shredded chicken, pour in condensed cream of mushroom soup, maybe toss in some peas, and bake the whole thing until warm and bubbly. It was creamy, comforting, and designed to make leftovers stretch a little farther. Recipes like this popped up in community cookbooks, homemaker magazines, and recipe boxes all over America from the 1950s through the 1980s. It was practical, filling, and came together with ingredients most folks had on hand. Some versions called for extra cheese or crunchy toppings, but most stayed simple. Over the years, as frozen dinners and fast food took over, casseroles like this faded quietly off most dinner tables. But for those who remember scooping out creamy, steamy spoonfuls straight from the oven, it brings back the comfort of simple meals that filled the house with warmth when life felt uncertain. Pineapple cheese casserole was one of those quirky dishes that popped up at Southern potlucks and church gatherings, and somehow stuck around long enough to be remembered fondly by anyone brave enough to try it. You would mix canned pineapple chunks with shredded cheddar cheese and top it all with buttery cracker crumbs before baking it into a sweet, salty, and surprisingly addictive casserole. It sounds odd, but it worked, especially on tables already filled with baked hams, fried chicken, and every casserole under the sun. This dish showed up in old church cookbooks, handwritten recipe cards, and potluck spreads from the 1950s through the 1970s, making use of pantry staples when fresh ingredients were scarce. Some versions leaned sweeter with extra sugar, while others embraced the salty, cheesy goodness. Over time, pineapple cheese casseroles slipped quietly off modern menus as trends moved toward more familiar comfort foods. But for anyone who remembers the first bite of melty cheese, sweet pineapple, and buttery topping, it is a reminder that sometimes the strangest combinations bring the most unexpected comfort. Meatball and spaghetti casserole was the go-to dinner when families wanted the comfort of spaghetti night but needed it to feed a crowd and stretch farther. You would layer cooked spaghetti with tomato sauce, scatter homemade or frozen meatballs on top, cover it with cheese, and bake it until bubbly and golden. It took the familiar flavors of spaghetti and meatballs and turned them into one easy, oven-baked dish. This casserole popped up in the 1960s and 1970s family cookbooks, clipped from magazines or scribbled on recipe cards. Some folks added extra sauce, others tossed in veggies, but the basics stayed the same: hearty, filling, and a great way to stretch ingredients. Over time, it disappeared from most dinner tables as frozen pasta meals and takeout pizza replaced old-school casseroles. But for anyone who remembers pulling a bubbling pan of cheesy, saucy spaghetti from the oven, it brings back the cozy feeling of family dinners when everyone gathered around for a simple, satisfying meal that made the most of what was on hand. Cheesy hash brown casserole was the guaranteed hit at church potlucks, holiday brunches, and neighborhood gatherings for decades, even though it barely shows up today. You would mix frozen hash browns with sour cream, shredded cheese, and sometimes cream soup, then bake it all until crispy and golden on top. It was rich, filling, and stretched simple ingredients into something that could feed a crowd without much effort. Recipes like this were tucked into faded community cookbooks or passed around on handwritten note cards marked potluck favorite or family brunch. It was the kind of dish that felt indulgent, but also practical, using everyday staples in a way that felt special. Some families added crushed crackers or cornflakes on top for extra crunch, but the creamy, cheesy potatoes were the real star. These days, quick frozen breakfasts and trendy brunch spots have pushed casseroles like this off most tables. But for anyone who remembers scooping out cheesy, steaming helpings of hash browns at family gatherings, it brings back a time when good food was simple, hearty, and shared. Baked macaroni and ham casserole was a frugal, filling dinner that made leftover holiday ham stretch long after the feast was over. You would stir chopped ham into creamy macaroni and cheese, pour it into a casserole dish, and bake it until golden and bubbling. The result was crispy on top, creamy in the middle, and hearty enough to keep everyone full. This casserole showed up in old community cookbooks, scribbled on index cards, or clipped from magazines promising leftover makeovers. It was an easy way to turn odds and ends into a cozy dinner with familiar flavors and simple steps. Some folks added peas or breadcrumbs, but even plain, it was pure comfort food. Over the years, casseroles like this have slipped from most kitchens, replaced by boxed meals or frozen options. But for those who remember scraping crispy cheese from the edges of the baking dish, it brings back the feeling of stretching ingredients, feeding the family, and finding comfort in simple, homemade meals when money and groceries were tight. Sausage and grits breakfast bake was the hearty Southern-inspired casserole that fueled busy mornings and lazy weekends alike, even though it rarely shows up today. You would cook creamy grits, stir in crumbled sausage, shredded cheese, and sometimes eggs, then bake it all until bubbly and set. The result was rich, comforting, and filling enough to keep everyone satisfied for hours. This casserole was a favorite in the South, showing up in old church cookbooks, potluck tables, and handwritten recipes passed down through families. It combined two staples, grits and sausage, into one easy make-ahead dish that worked for breakfast, brunch, or even dinner when groceries were low. Some versions added hot sauce or veggies, but most kept it plain and practical. Over time, casseroles like this have disappeared as modern breakfasts shifted to quicker, on-the-go options. But for anyone who remembers scooping out steamy, cheesy grits and sausage at family gatherings, it brings back the taste of slow mornings, hearty meals, and simple traditions that made the most of what you had. Carrot and raisin casserole was the quirky, sweet vegetable bake that popped up at retro holiday dinners, even though most folks barely mention it today. You would mix shredded carrots with raisins, eggs, sugar, and a little flour, then bake it into a warm, slightly sweet side dish that walked the line between dessert and dinner. It sounds strange now, but back in the 1960s and 1970s, recipes like this were everywhere, tucked into church cookbooks, scribbled on recipe cards, and served at potlucks alongside ham or turkey. It was an easy way to sneak vegetables onto the table using pantry staples and a touch of sweetness to make them more appealing. Some versions added nuts or coconut, but most kept it simple and thrifty. Over time, these kinds of casseroles faded away as tastes changed and new trends took over. But for those who remember scooping warm, slightly sweet carrots onto their plate, it brings back the feeling of holiday gatherings when even the oddest dishes had a place at the table. Old-fashioned bread and tomato bake was a Depression-era classic that turned stale bread and canned tomatoes into a filling, practical dinner when groceries were few and far between. You would cube up leftover bread, soak it in seasoned tomatoes, sprinkle on herbs if you had them, and bake until crisp and golden. It was simple, resourceful, and made the most of pantry staples that otherwise would have gone to waste. Recipes like this showed up in old cookbooks from the 1930s through the 1950s, passed down by families who knew how to stretch ingredients. It filled bellies, kept food costs low, and turned humble scraps into something satisfying. Some versions added cheese or onions, but most stayed plain and frugal. Over time, these bread-based casseroles vanished from most kitchens as convenience foods and modern trends took over. But for anyone who remembers the smell of tomatoes and crisp bread baking, it brings back the ingenuity of home cooks who knew how to make something comforting out of next to nothing. Liver and rice casserole was one of those frugal, filling meals that showed up in vintage cookbooks when times were tough and nothing could go to waste. You would cook rice, sauté chopped liver, mix it with onions and gravy, then bake the whole thing into a hearty, savory dish that stretched ingredients farther than you would expect. It was not the most popular dinner by today's standards, but during the Depression, wartime rationing, and lean years that followed, meals like this kept families fed. Recipes like this were tucked into old cookbooks, handwritten on note cards, and passed down by families who understood how to use every part of an animal. Some versions added herbs or breadcrumbs, but most stayed simple and practical. Over the years, casseroles like this disappeared as modern tastes moved away from organ meats. But for anyone who remembers scooping out warm rice and gravy with liver tucked inside, it brings back the reality of stretching groceries, making do, and finding comfort in meals that got the job done, even when choices were slim. Chicken spaghetti bake was the creamy, cheesy one-dish dinner that filled community cookbooks, fundraisers, and potlucks across America. You tossed cooked spaghetti with shredded chicken, condensed soup, cheese, and sometimes peas, then baked it until bubbly and golden. It turned pantry staples into a filling, practical dinner that stretched far and kept everyone satisfied. Recipes like this exploded in popularity through the 1960s and 1970s when casseroles were king and grocery budgets were tight. It fed a crowd without much fuss, and you could dress it up with extra cheese, spices, or veggies if you had them. Over time, casseroles like this slipped off most dinner tables as frozen meals and takeout replaced home cooking. But for anyone who remembers scooping out cheesy, saucy spaghetti and chicken onto plates, it brings back the feeling of comforting meals that made the most of what was available. Baked bean and sausage casserole was the hearty one-pan meal that filled small-town tables with savory comfort when groceries had to stretch. You baked canned beans with sliced sausage, topped it with breadcrumbs, and let it bubble until golden. It was rich, filling, and practical, using pantry staples to stretch meat for the whole family. Recipes like this lived in old church cookbooks and got passed down by families who knew how to make a little go far. It turned simple ingredients into a dinner that left nobody hungry, even when money was tight. Some versions added onions or molasses, but most kept it plain. Over time, casseroles like this faded as modern meals and frozen foods took over. But for anyone who remembers the smell of baked beans and sausage filling the kitchen, it brings back pride in practical cooking that kept families fed. Hot dog and corn casserole was the quirky, budget-friendly dinner that turned pantry staples into a filling meal when money was tight. You sliced hot dogs, stirred them into creamed corn, poured it into a casserole dish, and topped it with cornbread batter before baking. It was strange, sure, but from the 1950s to the 1970s, recipes like this were everywhere, filling recipe boxes and cookbooks across the country. It stretched a little meat, filled plates fast, and made sure nothing went to waste. Some versions added cheese, but most stuck to the basics. Over time, casseroles like this disappeared as frozen meals replaced home cooking. But for anyone who remembers spooning out steamy, sweet cornbread with salty hot dogs tucked inside, it brings back the creativity of meals that made do with what you had and still made dinner feel like home. The French also made a significant contribution to delicious casseroles with the easy shepherd's pie. It was a meaty casserole traditionally made with lamb meat. Shepherd's pie has its roots in British cuisine. The name shepherd's pie specifically refers to the use of lamb, while cottage pie is used when beef is the main ingredient. This one was an easy one to make as it didn't require hours of preparation. The dish became popular in the UK during the 19th century, particularly after the introduction of potatoes in the late 18th century. This one was used for meal prep, as it was great for making ahead and freezing. It was known as hachis parmentier in French cuisine, but different countries came up with their own version of the shepherd's pie. In Australia and New Zealand, it's often called cottage pie, and in some places the dish includes sweet potatoes or other unique toppings. Scalloped potatoes, on the other hand, were a type of fusion food, if you could call it that, which people gladly welcomed with open arms. Thinly sliced potatoes that were put in a casserole dish and baked with cream or milk till the potatoes hit just the right amount of softness. End results were quite impressive as well, with people later adding cheese and fried onions to make various different fun ideas on the dish. As far as happy foods go, it may have left out the more filling and savory aspects of a standard casserole, but it was unmatched in terms of taste. Many movie marathons have been sustained purely on scalloped potatoes and some hot wings or potato wedges. People truly love this simple yet sweet dish, which seemed to give them a childish sense of glee. Lots of folk tend to find new favorite foods pretty fast, though, and old ones like scalloped potatoes become history book pages. With baked nectarine chicken salad, you had two things, a few aspects that were really important and simple. These parts of the dish were crucial if you wanted to nail it right. The baked chicken, for example, was a really touch-and-go situation. It was so easy for people to over-season it or under-season it, which would often lead to chicken that didn't sit well with the nectarines. Mostly people would use chicken breasts and thighs so that their flavors could bounce off of everything else while the meat itself would be soft and chewable. This was only boosted by the fact that it was marinated and then rubbed in a lot of herb mixes built to work with nectarines. The fruit themselves have a pretty natural sweetness to them that gives them a unique texture. If you bake them, they sort of soften, and that gives them an entirely new layer of texture and flavor. The nuts and cheese, plus the dressing, are small side elements, but they take a lot of attention to detail to shine. You want to toast the almonds just until they're slightly crunchy, and no more. Goat cheese works best here, or blue cheese if you can't find any. The dressing, a light vinaigrette, is probably the most important part. This is what will decide whether all these otherwise conflicting ingredients come together. It's a funny world, isn't it? A spaghetti pie casserole is somehow easier to make than a simple baked chicken salad. But well, that's the level of skill the recipe wants out of you. Vegetable pie recipes go all the way back to Europe, but this is about America, so let's stick to the Cliff Notes version of our history tour. Sweet potato pie actually got very popular in the southern parts of the USA during the colonial era, when America was still a colony under the British Empire. Sweet potatoes had always been used by Southern folk in their desserts. Initially, the vegetable was popularized by Black American households that spread their magic across the nation. It gets more interesting, though, as word is they got the idea from Native American cooking practices. Basically, the rabbit hole of who made it first can go deep, but none of that matters when you consider how cost-effective and delicious this pie is. Potatoes in general were becoming the top most consumed vegetable, and to find a way to incorporate it into a dessert for the masses is cooking talent at its finest. Similar to funeral pies, transparent pies also had a tacky name with incredible flavors. The pie emerged in the 1800s around the northern Kentucky region, where people had very few ingredients for a pie due to financial constraints. Still, the cravings were there, and they needed to be filled, especially if you had kids in the households. So people invented the transparent pie, which used the most bare bones of ingredients like flour, eggs, and butter. Fast forward to the 70s, and the case was still very much the same. Summer vacation, hungry kids, and an empty pantry. So what is a 1970s stay-at-home wife baker to do? Simple. Go for a quick and easy transparent pie which could not fail you, even with the limited ingredients, and whipped cream made this a proper treat. People today definitely could not make a pie out of such little ingredients though, so the pie vanished. Here is a casserole that came from Latin American cuisine and worked really well, which is the infamous Mexican egg casserole. Typically stuffed with popular Mexican spices and chilies, along with eggs baked into a dish jam packed with cheese, this meant that you had no worries. Ordering this meant you were getting twice the bang for your buck. No tastes were coming close to the area of flavors this was in, and none that tried to copy it succeeded. See, American flavors do work, but they often have a certain blandness. Spices are not as prevalent in traditional American cuisine, and dishes like these help fill that gap. Mexican egg casseroles were a common find at any Latin American diner or restaurant, perfect as takeout, a meal to enjoy on a date, or even as a treat to savor all by yourself. Nowadays, most restaurants do not commonly sell this casserole anymore, but some old-school Mexican joints may still make a mean one. You can't possibly reminisce about Grandma's forgotten casseroles without bringing up the ham and potato casserole. This one combined two classic comfort foods, ham and potatoes, and instantly became a favorite on the dining table. You know all those leftover ham that goes bad in your refrigerator after the holidays? Well, this recipe was a way to spice it up and turn it into something new, and of course, Grandma did it best. There was even a healthier version of the ham and potato casserole that was made using lean ham, low-fat dairy products, and extra vegetables to boost the nutritional content. Grandma used whatever potatoes she could find at the farmer's market, but this one could be made by a variety. Some recipes called for russets, while others used Yukon Gold or red potatoes, depending on your texture preference. Yet chicken and rice casseroles, despite employing similar ideas of basic dishes that work great along with a fine casserole, did not hit as well as people thought it would. The textures of grilled chunks of chicken with rice, gravy, or a spicy sauce and cheese were not appealing. Not as much as it theoretically should be, but so many things are better in imagination than on a plate at your table. Chicken and rice casseroles definitely were something that had a very natural fall into irrelevance. They did not have much of a presence back in the day either. People wanted their casseroles to feel like a buffed-up pizza, and this just was not doing that for folks. So it has become an idea health-obsessed housewives from the 70s may remember. Be very wary of what you see on the internet when you search for a Jefferson Davis pie. For some reason, a lot of traditional recipes out there have started leaving out literally everything that makes this pie special. See, a proper Jefferson Davis pie is an antique 1970s recipe for sure, but even in the earliest 19th century references in cookbooks, it is dried fruit pie. Jefferson Davis made with spices, dates, pecans, and raisins, very each thick custard filling. In different parts of the South, the concentrated bourbon syrup to go along with it also got popular, but the pie worked as it was too. People were a little hesitant to try a pie with spices. But as far as vintage recipes go, both in the field, this pie left no boxes unchecked. We are quite sad to see it go, really. Frog eye salad, on the other hand, is something that came right out of the middle half of the 20th century. Now, I'm not too sure where people really got this one from. I mean, you'd think it came right from some community shacked up outside a swamp. Strangely enough, no frogs were harmed in the making of this plate of food. Instead, there's this specific kind of pasta they use. It's called acini di pepe, and it's this really small, almost bubbly-looking pasta that apparently has a pretty striking similarity to frog eyes once you cook it and bring all of it together. Now, a typical frog eye salad takes this pasta, puts in some whipped cream, pineapples, oranges, and coconut, and then it's chilled. You kind of want to picture something similar to tapioca or the texture of boba. It's a pretty unique dish, and if you start going through some cookbooks that had their peak sales during the 1950s, you'll definitely find this. For two reasons. One, it was just one of the most perfect salads to go with your potluck. Two, potluck culture as a whole was really on the rise. Ewing Steele's orange rolls are a wholesome little pit stop in Southern and Midwestern cooking. They're fluffy, sweet, and just about the opposite of everything you've come to expect so far on this list. The dish itself refers to a pretty specific variant that got popular throughout the South. Ewing Steele himself is known for making these. I mean, it's in the name. But the rolls themselves represented a lot. They had typical American baking traditions such as puff pastries and buttery rolls, but they mixed that in with oranges, sweet tastes, and really comforting textures. That was common in Southern desserts, so it was a blend of both points of American cooking. Now, while people believe that Ewing Steele made it, they aren't sure, because there's no documented recipe or cookbook that shows us a process of him developing the dish. All we know is that it first popped up in the South, and then it popped up at everyone's potlucks. Those bright citrus flavors were the perfect thing to bring to a potluck. Chess pies are similar to both Osgood pies and Jefferson pies, but they leave out the meringue and creamy toppings for an even fundamental flavor profile. Simply put, chess pies are all about taking the basic ingredients that make a pie and nailing them completely. The most liberty this dish takes is some vanilla and tart lemon juice, which we mean, come on, we just talked about literal fried pies. A very do one thing but do it right type of pie. It was an incredible choice for gentlemen who love to go to parlors and pubs for a round of chess. As you can guess, that is also where it got its name, because they would order chess pies over a few rounds. Today, both chess pies and the game it gets its identity from are things that were much more popular in the 70s. Speaking of buttery pies, let's talk about the grapefruit meringue pie, which was one of the propellers of meringue pies in America, and your grandparents played no small part in that. Citrusy, creamy, and sour but fruity, this pie had an incredibly diverse range of flavors, giving it an edge over other pies in the game. It stood out for all the right reasons, and the aroma called to you every time, especially if it was coming from your grandmother's house as you got out of the car. Golden brown tart lemon layers with the sweetest, thickest meringue you could imagine on top, and some fresh grapefruits right from the market was about as good as being a kid could get in the 20th century. Let's be honest, no one did casseroles quite like the Southerners, and their classic cornbread casserole spoke for itself. Cornbread has been a staple in many grandma's kitchens for generations. It's often passed down through family recipes, with each grandma adding her own unique twist. This is one of the most famous members of the casserole families and was a staple at family dinners and potlucks. The best part? Anyone could make it. Yes, it was that easy. You just had to mix the ingredients, pour them into a baking dish, and let the oven do the work. It was a great everyday dinner, especially for busy cooks looking for a fuss-free meal. You could also customize this casserole and experiment with different types of cheese. Just like its predecessor on this list, baked spaghetti casseroles did not last too long either. We remember well and clear what people's candid opinions on beef and noodles casserole was. A lot of the millennial crowd believed that it was a dish with no real sense of self. Like if you want spaghetti, just have spaghetti. Casseroles are somewhere else on the spectrum, and maybe they were right in avoiding it without even a single try. Some people did give it a fair shot, though, and ended up liking it. But the general consensus was that spaghetti sauces do not go well with casserole dishes. Nor do they fare well when baked with cheese. Baked spaghetti casseroles kind of had a cult following, and because of that, they never lasted long enough to be more than a footnote in the ages. Vinegar pies shook the baking world up at the start of the 1970s as bakeries started serving the odd pie across the states. Bakers began adding vinegar to the dough whilst also using a vinegar-filling topping it off with whipped cream. Bakeries did this because the vinegar gave the texture of the crust a pretty noticeable glow-up, while also adding a unique tartness to the pie. Usually, apple cider vinegar and brown sugar would be used to balance each other out, and the aroma as well as the set of flavors made this a holiday favorite. Everyone can remember their grandma enthusiastically coming out of the kitchen with a fat vinegar pie on Thanksgiving, right? For Americans who wanted to be whisked away to days when they were 7 and nothing mattered except hearing the school bell ringing, this pie was the one. America found other ways to have nostalgia trips eventually, and vinegar pies are now just a forgotten classic. Lemon lime poke cake is pretty much one of the best dishes to get if you want a kind of dessert that's moist, spongy, and still citrusy. Sounds like a specific combination? You'd actually be super surprised to see how many people walk into a bakery with a list of flavors that matches exactly that. Why do you think they had so many bakeries serving poke cake? It became a potluck must-have during the 1960s when easy-to-prepare desserts were taking over bakers and their kitchens. They were how people first began to use boxed cake mixes, which were still a pretty new item. Only a while had passed since their introduction into the American food scene back then. What's the reason people prepared them for potlucks? Well, it was simple. It cut down the work. Listen, a potluck is supposed to be, and I know this seems redundant or even contradictory, a relaxing experience where you come, sit, and enjoy food with the rest of your family. In that sense, you'd want dishes you can make ahead of time, the kind where you only have to put them on the stove or pop the oven open, and that's exactly what lemon lime poke cake was. Poke cakes in general were extremely flexible and convenient, and they still are popular today. Though the entire culture surrounding this specific one and potlucks is something long gone. Since we are on the topic of tropical pies, let's take a look at chocolate haupia pies, which were a pretty regular staple of Hawaiian cuisine. These also had their fair share of coconut-based goodness, as they would be covered with a coconut haupia layer that would be made using thickened coconut milk. Then you would just layer the chocolate into a pie crust and top it off with however much whipped cream you fancied. Next to hula pie, this is probably one of the most famous pies to ever come from the island of Hawaii, and even McDonald's had their own brief take on it, though it came nowhere close to the bangers you would experience from the locals. If you are one of the people who enjoys a good coconut-based dessert, then maybe try this one out someday. There is probably a good reason why it got so popular across America. Remember when Campbell's cream of mushroom soup and canned tuna were the stars of the food aisle back in the day? Well, Grandma took those humble ingredients and spun them into her classic tuna noodle casserole. During the 1950s and 1960s, convenience foods were all the rage, and tuna noodle casserole fit the bill perfectly. It was a post-World War II creation and was whipped up in no time with ingredients already on hand. Plus, it was a classic comfort food that brought everyone together at Graham's dinner table. During the mid-20th century, tuna noodle casserole was a mainstay in American cookbooks and cooking magazines. It was often featured in advertisements and was promoted as a quick and easy dish for the busy homemaker. This one fell out of flavor, but thanks to the recent revival of noodle dishes, we might see this one back on the menus soon. In the meantime, why not dust off Grandma's old cookbooks and bring it back yourself? Corn pudding is a dish that may not have been as grand as the rest so far, but it was a simple DIY casserole that made your day. Corn pudding was made with stewed corn and thickening agents that helped give it a pudding or custard-like texture. However, it was not typically baked in a traditional casserole case. Instead, it had a custard dish that the pudding would go into and then be baked in. Now, down in the South, this was the food gospel. People just loved it all over, especially in less urban areas where corn was widely and daily consumed, particularly during times of economic uncertainty when households had to cut corners in the kitchen. Corn pudding was a cheap and easy-to-make casserole that was not too shabby. Nowadays, people like that have moved more to poaching local wildlife than taking Mother Nature's gifts, and as a result, corn pudding went extinct too. So, triple mash with horseradish breadcrumbs is a bit of a funny combination. It's definitely the kind of flavor you would always expect out of a cookbook right out of the middle of the 20th century. The triple mash here is also pretty much just a sign of the times. You take 3 distinctly different vegetables, such as potatoes, and 2 other root ones. Now this could be parsnips, turnips, or whatever else gets you going. All you gotta do is just boil and steam them after. And then, once they're soft enough, turn all of that into a mash. The vegetables actually make an extremely flavorful meal. As true as that is, the real star of this show is the horseradish breadcrumbs. This topping helps add a much-needed crunch factor to dishes, which we all know goes lovely with any kind of potato food. Then you throw in some aromatics and herbs. It's actually one of the best side dishes to serve if you're looking to spice up your potluck, and it's a tried and tested variant that you can't really go wrong with. Plus, the horseradish dips work great around Christmas because it can go with so much more besides just the mash too. One blessed thing about the hand of a passionate grandparent cooking for their favorite family members is that they always knew how to get the best out of the bland and boring. Things like apples were suddenly key players in cultural delicacies like apple cider vinegar pie, when before, parents would struggle to get their kids to even maintain eye contact with an apple for more than 10 seconds. Granted, these were sautéed apples with vinegar, vanilla, cinnamon, and a lot of time in the oven, but they were still irresistible. A good cinnamon or maple syrup was the perfect sauce to round this pie off and bring its full potential as an acidic but sweet slice of heaven out. Apple cider vinegar has been a popular hit in America for many decades now, and it does not look like the grandparents of today intend to change that. So, tamales are a labor of love, but thanks to Grandma, this tamale pie was a much easier way to enjoy the flavors. This casserole caught on like fire in the early 20th century, particularly in the Southwest, where Mexican influence was strong. Just like most casseroles on the list, this one-dish wonder was also a creation of the Depression era. Some versions of this pie started out as a way to use up leftovers, such as bits of meat, vegetables, and even leftover chili. But hey, no one complained because the end result was a delicious dinner. Many families have an heirloom recipe for this casserole passed down from generation to generation. So if this casserole brings back memories from your childhood, it might be time to give Grandma a call. She could be holding on to a secret recipe that she's finally ready to pass down to you. The Hamburger Helper casserole takes the flashiness factor and ups it to a 10 unlike corn pudding. Blurring the lines between a casserole and lasagna, this dish also blurred the lines between a simple Tuesday baking session and a literal gift of God. Consisting of pasta, hamburger patties, and a cheesy sauce layered on top, this mixture was then baked into a casserole. As you kept getting deeper into the behemoth, the more irresistible it would get. Although this dish was really high in saturated fats and calories, most doctors recommended avoiding trendy foods like these for their link to heart problems too. Hence, people took much more cautionary attitudes toward their line blurring, making Hamburger Helper pizzas a thing of the past. Before we leave the South, let's talk about fried pies, which sort of blur the line between a fried pocket and a pie. Pie crusts that were fried and filled with various fruit or cream fillings became incredibly trendy in the South. Actually, most things battered and deep-fried tend to come from the South, so there really is no surprise here. Your mind might be thinking this would not work and that the flavors are too different, but it actually clicked. Folks from outside those parts of the USA also would pick these turnover-like pastries, enjoying the harmony of fruits and fried dough. Fried pies gave people a similar feeling to eating a chocolate donut, since sometimes they would be filled with chocolate. Currently, it is just a forgotten Southern legend. Sadly, since America moved on to healthier pies. Oxtail stew has a pretty celebrated and deep history. and I really want to take you through all of it. Globally, it's always been at the forefront of African, Caribbean, and Nigerian cultures. Oxtail itself refers to the tail of the cattle, which was one of the cheapest kinds of meat you could buy. It was typically always used for stews because of the amount of collagen in it. You'd slow cook this bad boy for hours until you got a dish that was literally bursting with flavor. Caribbean and West African cooking both have different takes on it that they've introduced into the wider scope of American food. Basically, during the Great Migration around the 20th century, lots of Africans started coming to bustling cities with traffic and waves of immigrants. That, of course, meant that there were loads of people who had to be cooked for now, and oxtail stew was a dish that understood that assignment better than anything else. It became extremely common for people to bring oxtail stew to the family potluck in the 1950s and even further, especially as it became a big part of soul food and Southern culture. Even today, it's a pretty well-known part of African American culture in America, and you'd be pretty hard-pressed to find someone who hasn't tried it. So, we will start this list off by paying respects to tradition as our elders did much before us with their cooking. And what better dish for that than Southern possum pie? A graham cracker crust with sweetened cream cheese and pecans made for an incredibly earthy, crunchy pie that felt amazing to munch with every bite. The crust was to die for, and it made the pecans so much more appetizing than they had any right to be. Pair that up with some creamy pudding, 2 layers of chocolate and vanilla, and last but not least, topping it off with some whipped cream, and you have one incredible competitor for Sunday's lunch plans. Though we all know our grandmas would make too much for one sitting anyway. Eggplant Parmesan casserole is another Italian classic that became a favorite in the United States. Eggplant was often a challenge to serve to picky eaters, so Grandma got creative and found a way to sneak it into delicious dishes, which resulted in the creation of this hearty dish. In Italy, it's better known as Parmigiana and is a popular gourmet dish. The casserole is a more laid-back version of the delicacy, as you can enjoy the flavors of this classic Italian dish without all the work of frying each individual slice of eggplant. Don't get me wrong, Graham loved making us those labor-intensive meals, but even she deserved a break sometimes. And this casserole gave her the perfect opportunity to whip up something delicious without spending hours in the kitchen. Now let's put the Frankenburger casseroles and chicken pot pies aside and go back to a real icon like the shepherd's pie. Your mother knows of this, her mother knows of this, her mother's dad knows of this, and his fourth cousin had this every year for family gatherings. Not an exaggeration by any means, the shepherd's pie really was just that loved across every state. Just simple meats like lamb or ground beef cooked or minced to their limit, baked and topped with mashed potatoes in a casserole. Literally, what more does a person even ask of a plate of food? Can we get much higher? Was the question on most chefs' minds, as shepherd's pie was hard to improve on, making the market highly competitive. No one had one unique standout shepherd's pie, and most were as good as each other. Of course, that meant great things for customers, but sadly, those days of privilege and good-tasting casseroles are gone now. Shepherd's pie is more a Southern tradition than a statewide phenomena now. In America, so many communities live together that often one will borrow from another, and such the case with funeral pies. Why do they have such a depressing name? Well, the pie was most often seen at funerals and was given to families as a consolation food. Most people agree that it got its name from how often they were seen at funerals. However, what we do know is that among the Amish community, these were not an omen of a deceased relative, but a sign of a delicious evening. Also, they continued the trend of spices and raisins being used in pies. Funeral pies eventually even made their way to Southern USA cuisine, but today, even at a funeral, you would not find this. Spaghetti pie casserole is probably one of the first instances we have of fusion food overtaking common American interests. While it doesn't really have a well-documented starting point in history like some other burgers and loaves do, it is pretty interesting to see the kind of pipeline this place has taken. The casserole craze in the middle of the 20th century reflected the broader interest of Americans dipping their toes into foreign cuisines, especially whatever the French and Italians had cooked up. Something about their kitchens was irresistible to most people. people seem to believe that this dish got its inspiration from lasagna and baked ziti, which I can't lie makes sense. Both of those have been a big part of Italian-American culture for ages now, and spaghetti, despite not being typical in Italy, has become a really popular choice for American homes. A spaghetti pie itself was purely a home chef classic, though, and it was thanks to how available processed ingredients were becoming. Now that you could just buy pre-made crusts and spaghetti packets, a lot of the work that people associated with it before just went up in the air. You may not believe this, but it was actually easy to prepare for this. Tell us your favorite forgotten casserole in the comments. Give this video a like and subscribe for more comforting blasts from the past.